Quick hits. This is the part of the show where I talk about a few things that caught my eye when I was looking at the news over the last few days, and perhaps it caught your eye as well. Lower interest rates drove Canadian GDP higher. That's probably an obvious one. When interest rates come down, growth starts to go higher, and we've seen that recently. Canadian banks are pushing to get rid of interprovincial trade barriers. There are trade barriers between the provinces. Yes, if you can believe it, trading between provinces is something that happens, or we would like to see it happen a lot more. And there's talk that perhaps GDP in Canada could increase by removing those trade barriers. Last but not least, a funny one, bit of a funny one. Warren Buffett calls tariffs an act of war. And he says the tooth fairy doesn't pay them or is not going to be paying these tariffs. It's going to come from the consumer or the businesses. So let's talk briefly about the first one. Lower interest rates drove Canadian GDP higher. And we have our first chart here, changes in Canadian GDP. And you can see how well GDP has done on a quarterly, well, you can see here, quarterly basis here. You can see GDP has been moving higher, Q4, Q3, Q2, etc. This is the change in GDP, definitely doing better than it was earlier in the year. You can see some charts actually showing a negative there. And I really believe this is because the Bank of Canada has aggressively cut rates. And to combat all the turmoil and slowing growth that tariffs can put on our economy here in Canada, US tariffs, I think you're going to see that the Bank of Canada cut rates a lot quicker going forward. So if you're all looking at perhaps getting a mortgage, a variable rate mortgage, I think you can look to seeing those mortgage rates fall in the coming quarters. The next topic that we have out of the quick hits, Canadian banks are pushing to remove interprovincial barriers. And there was some talk that you could see as much as, I think it was 3.2%. I saw that number somewhere. Much as 3.2% gain in growth for the country if you just remove the barriers between the provinces. When you look at what the tariffs may cost Canada, I've seen numbers in that 3 to 4% range about regarding GDP. So perhaps if we get rid of interprovincial barriers, we can offset a lot of the negativity that tariffs are going to cause. Something that I know banks, obviously, and provinces have been discussing and have made note of. Our chart here, our one chart here, talks about internal trade barrier costs are greater for smaller provinces, which makes sense. So PEI, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, these are the provinces that will benefit from getting rid of a lot of those trade barriers if possible. Obviously, it'll help a lot of other provinces, such as our province, Ontario, BC. But of course, our province is big enough to to withstand a lot of what's going to happen, more so than a smaller province, which if they had access to other markets in the country, they would fare a lot better. So hopefully we'll see these interprovincial trade barriers come down. Our last quick hit was that quote by Warren Buffett talking about, hey, it's not the tooth fairy that's going to pay these tariffs. It's going to come from either businesses or the consumer. So where the government is saying, countries around the world are going to pay these tariffs, swallow these tariffs, make a lot of money for the United States. It's possible, but I don't think it's going to come from Canada. I think it's going to come from the consumer, the end user, and or the business themselves. And this is actually his quote. Tariffs are actually, we've had a lot of experience with them. They're an act of war to some degree. So he went on a limb and called it an act of war. Over time, they are a tax on goods. I mean, the tooth fairy doesn't pay them. And so even Warren Buffett is chiming in and arguably the best investor of our generation, and obviously saying or stopping maybe just one level short of saying that these tariffs shouldn't be applied, but he's obviously saying that they are and can be harmful to the economy. So those are your quick hits, and as I said, I wanted to end off with a bit of a humorous one from Warren Buffett.